Hello everyone and welcome to another recorded lecture of Anatomy and Physiology 1 online. Today we'll discuss Chapter 6, which is on the integumentary system. The integumentary system consists of skin, hair, nails, and their associated glands. And when we say integument, we are referring to skin specifically, or epidermis. And we learned last time that the epidermis is also called the cutaneous membrane. So epidermis, skin, and cutaneous membrane are all referring to parts of the integumentary system. And dermatology is the scientific study and medical treatment of the integumentary system. So did you know that your body sheds about 500 million dead skin cells every single day? That's about 1.5 pounds of dead skin every single year. And your entire epidermis turns over, means gets killed and gets replaced every 21 days. So all of your new cells replace any old cells that are killed, and that gets shed off. And your skin accounts for about 8% of your body weight. So this little membrane, right, takes a lot of space on your body, and for good reason. There are many, many functions of skin. And because skin is so vulnerable, right, it needs to be very, very resistant. Skin is always exposed to radiation and trauma, infection, chemicals from the environment. So it's no surprise that the skin must receive more medical treatment than any other organ system. The skin performs many important functions. First, it protects us against trauma and infections, right? The skin suffers the most physical injuries to the body, but it can resist and recover from trauma better than any other organ. That has a lot to do with the nature of skin itself, and they have a lot of that keratin protein that keeps those cells, those epithelial cells, very tightly linked together, so they resist any trauma. Also, it's very hard for microorganisms to colonize skin because skin is slightly acidic and it's kept rather dry and scaly to prevent things from colonizing and overtaking. Skin also serves as a barrier to water. It prevents the body from absorbing too much water when we're in the bath, but even more importantly, prevents our body from losing water from dehydration. The epidermis is also a great barrier to UV rays, blocks a lot of it, but not all of it. Another function of skin is to synthesize vitamin D. So the skin is where the first step in vitamin D synthesis occurs, and we need that for bone development. We'll talk a lot more about that when we discuss the skeletal system. The skin can help us absorb hydrophobic vitamins like vitamin K, A, and E, in addition to vitamin D. Skin also helps us excrete oils, sweat, and wax through glands that we will discuss later. Skin has a very important role in thermoregulation. So the skin actually receives 10 times as much blood flow as it needs for its own maintenance. And all of this really relates to the important in regulating body temperature. The skin has a lot of control over how to respond to changes in atmospheric temperature. In response to chilling, the body can retain its heat by constricting all the blood vessels of the dermis. So you basically make them more narrow. So it keeps the blood deeper to the body, and it doesn't let that blood, the heat from the blood dissipate on the outside. In response to overheating, it will lose excess heat by dilating those vessels, allowing more blood to flow close to the surface of the body, so more heat will be lost. So again, this thermoregulation, vasoconstriction versus vasodilation, is very important. The skin also helps us perceive pain and temperature. We have special receptors, tactile receptors, and nociceptors that can detect temperature, touch, etc. And finally, skin really helps us to communicate. So humans and other primates have a lot more expressions on their faces than other mammals, and that's because our skeletal muscles insert in the dermis and pull on the skin to create different facial expressions. Also, the appearance of our skin, hair, and nails can give a clue about our health, our overall health. So again, lots of different functions of skin. So skin, the cutaneous membrane, has two layers. The first is the epidermis. The deep layer is the dermis. So we're going to talk about each. Right? The subcutaneous tissue is called the hypodermis. In general, the prefix epi means above, and hypo means less than or lower. So the dermis is in the middle. This is the dermis. Epidermis is on top. Hypodermis is on the bottom. Another way to remember this is subcutaneous. Sub means beneath. Cutaneous is the skin. So the layer beneath the skin is the subcutaneous tissue, aka hypodermis. So keep these names in mind because the names make sense. And I'll refer to this picture quite a bit. We see over here, we have our epidermis that's going to have keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium, as we'll soon see. Lots of dead skin up here. And then here we start our dermis. This is the dermis. And the dermis can be divided into two separate layers itself. And then we have the hypodermis. And we have lots of blood vessels in the hypodermis, not as much in the epidermis. So what is the epidermis? We said it was keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. It is avascular, meaning it lacks blood vessels and therefore depends on the diffusion of nutrients from the underlying connective tissue. It does have some nerve endings for touch and pain, but most sensations of the skin are due to nerve endings in the dermis, actually. But the epidermis is a protective structure. It protects the body against pathogens, against UV, and again, like we said, against dehydration. But it also makes sure that we don't get burned by chemicals, right? So a chemical burn can be stopped at the epidermis so it doesn't go beneath into the dermis and then into our bloodstream. And it's the epidermis that also makes up hair follicles, and glands. So what kind of cell make up the epidermis? Well, it's keratinocytes, and they're named because of their role in synthesizing keratin. So when you're looking at skin, almost all the epidermal cells are keratinocytes. And these keratinocytes are organized into distinct layers, and they continually produce keratin protein in the process of keratinization. And that causes the cells to get harder and flatter and more waterproof. So as these cells down here become keratinized, they become flatter, harder, and more waterproof. So there are different layers of the epidermis. And all of the cells move from deep. This is the deepest layer of the epidermis over here. They move from deep to superficial. As the cells move and migrate from deep to superficial, they lose organelles and they start to gain more keratin. Okay, so cells are arranged in layers, and this basal layer, this lower level called the stratum basale, or the basal layer, is the deepest layer of the epidermis, and that contains stem cells that are going to actively do mitosis. That's where mitosis occurs. So cells only do mitosis in the stratum basale, which is the basal layer, and that's where all these stem cells are found. So they're going to divide. And as they divide, they start to migrate up. So they start to divide and then migrate upward. Meanwhile, on the most superficial end, we have the corneal layer, or the stratum corneum. And the stratum corneum consists of up to 30 layers of dead, scaly, keratinized squamous cells that is very resistant to abrasion. But again, what we have here is from down here, we have these cells with organelles and not much keratin. But as they migrate up through the stratum spinosum, granulosum, the lucidum layer, they lose all their organelles and gain more and more keratin until they are fully keratinized. And these keratinized cells on the superficial layer are continually lost and replaced by the cells that grow deeper. It takes about 10 days for a cell to migrate from the basal layer all the way up to the stratum corneum. And then the cell spends about 2 weeks in the stratum corneum until it gets taken off by just like as dead skin, like just flaky skin. So that's what explains as like all of your skin has a 3-week around a 3-week lifespan from when they start to grow in the basal layer to how they migrate up and begin keratinization, and then until they just hang out and then they get killed and just fly off. So that's the lifespan of the life history of a keratinocyte, right? And it's because we constantly lose epidermal cells from the skin surface, they must be replaced. And mitosis requires an abundant supply of oxygen and nutrients, and that's why mitosis can only occur in the basal layer, where it has access to more of the vascular tissue, so you can get the nutrients that we need. So there are many other cells that we need in the epidermis. One are called melanocytes. So melanocytes are also found in the basal layer. So here we have a little melanocyte. So they only occur in the basal layer. And these develop pigmentation. They synthesize the brown-black pigment melanin. And we'll talk a lot more about that because they help us get protected against UV light. So they protect our DNA. They also have a role in skin colorization. Dendritic cells are found in the 2 layers of the epidermis called the stratum spinosum and the granulosum. These are immune cells. They're white blood cells of the immune system that can engulf pathogens by phagocytosis. And they could basically stand guard against any toxins, microbes, or pathogens that want to penetrate into the skin. Dendritic cells are also cool because once they engulf the invader, they can present some of the pieces of that invader on their surface to alert other cells of the immune system that there's something going on, that there's danger, there's a threat. We then have tactile cells, which are relatively few in number, but these are receptors for touch and pressure. We see these also in the basal layer of the epidermis, and they're always associated with an underlying dermal nerve fiber. Together, we take the tactile cell and the nerve fiber, we call that a tactile disc. So here's this tactile cell, and here's the neuron, and together we call this a tactile disc. And this can help us detect any pressure when we touch something. What type of cell makes up the epidermis? So pause here and answer this question. And the answer is D, right? Stratified keratinized squamous. So now we can talk about the dermis. So beneath the epidermis is a connective tissue layer called the dermis, and it ranges in thickness. For example, it's only 0.2 millimeters thick in the eyelids, but it's 4 millimeters thick in the palms and soles. It mainly consists of collagen, but has a lot of other protein fibers that help give it a lot of strength for support. The dermis is divided into 2 layers. The papillary layer is the first, and that's a thin zone of areolar connective tissue. So this is the papillary layer up here. Loose connective tissue. And this loosely organized tissue allows for different white blood cells to migrate and to invade anything that might pose a threat to us. So it's good that we have this loose connective tissue in the papillary layer. It has what are called dermal papillae. Dermal papillae are these little protrusions, little finger-like extensions of the dermis. And this helps project blood vessels deep into the dermis. So these dermal papillae are little protrusions. And again, this is going to help interlock the epidermis with the dermis as well. The papillary layer is very loose, we said, with areolar connective tissue. And that explains how it can have a lot of blood vessels and touch receptors because of that loose connective tissue. So it's well supplied with blood vessels, glands, and nerve endings. Then we have the reticular layer. And the reticular layer of the dermis is deeper and much thicker. And it consists of dense, irregular connective tissue. Right? Dense, irregular. So it's deeper and thicker than the papillary. And again, what makes it irregular is that you have irregularly shaped bundles of collagen. Right? It's very rich in collagen. So it's a lot more tough. And the collagen forms thicker bundles with not a lot of room for ground substance. So there's not much fat, not much space for things to crawl around. It's very dense with collagen. Stretching of the skin in obesity and pregnancy can tear these collagen fibers and produce stretch marks, actually. So again, what gives our skin its strength is the reticular layer of the dermis, because it has that dense, irregular connective tissue that has tons of collagen and elastic proteins, giving our skin the strength it needs. Right, and of course, in the reticular layer, we have more receptors. So let's say, so far we said the epidermis had 5 layers. This is the basal layer, is the deepest. The most superficial is the corneal layer. Then we have the papillary layer of the dermis, which is loose connective tissue. Then we have the reticular layer of the dermis, which is dense, irregular connective tissue. And then below that, we said was the hypodermis, or the subcutaneous tissue, which has a lot of fat and blood vessels. So the boundary between the epidermis and the dermis is a little weird when you look at it. It's very wavy, right? A lot of protrusions go up and down, up and down. So each of these papillae, these protrusions, help interlock with the dermis. We call each of these, this is an epidermal ridge. This is an epidermal ridge, and this is a dermal papilla. And these interlock, almost like corrugated cardboard. And this arrangement prevents any slippage of the epidermis across the dermis, keeps them interlocked. Right? So the dermal papillae help form the epidermal ridges to keep these interlocked in place. And this is what produces fingerprints and toe prints. So if you look closely at your fingerprints, you will notice these epidermal ridges. And not much is known about the evolution of fingerprints. Some people think that it has to do with grip. That's possible, helps us grip a little bit. Another phenomenon that's interesting is like when we go into the ocean or water, we get prune fingers, right? Like our fingers kind of swell up a little bit. Well, we don't really know exactly why that happens. There might be a little more to the story, but it does seem likely that the buckling of skin might have a function to, like a tire treading, to kind of channel water away and to improve grip when our hands are a little slippery. So when we get prune fingers, it might be easier for us to climb out and hold on to a rock maybe. Again, I don't know if this is entirely true. We do know that the pruning is caused by the stratum corneum absorbing too much water. Remember, it's usually dry. That corneal layer is very dry, but when it's exposed to tons of water, it soaks it up like a sponge and gets pruny. Anyway, now we can talk about what lies beneath the dermis, which is the subcutaneous tissue, or the hypodermis. So the subcutaneous tissue consists largely of areolar and adipose tissue. Right? It's padding the body, and it helps bind the skin to the underlying tissue. Right? That's its main function, attaches skin to the deeper tissues and the organs. It's also where white blood cells have free range to act because it's very loose. So cells can freely migrate there. The hypodermis itself, again, is rich in adipose tissue, which can help absorb any force created by impact, like a shock absorber. Also serves as an energy reservoir and thermal insulation. Right, it can conserve body heat. Finally, branches of his blood vessels and the nerves supply the dermis. Because of the areolar connective tissue is so loose, we could have a lot of vascularization and a lot of nerves supply the dermis. So I'd like you to pause here and identify all of these parts that we've spoken about so far. You should be able to find everything, even without the labels. So here, starting from the bottom, we have the dermis. Right, this is the papillary layer of the dermis with these dermal papillae. You can see this is the stratum basale, which is the basal layer. Here's a stem cell in mitosis. These are supplied by blood vessels in the dermis. We also have some keratinocytes that have melanin, called melanocytes. Right, these are melanocytes that can develop, they can put pigment, they can put the melanin into keratinocytes. And these are all keratinocytes. All of these cells are keratinocytes. These up here are dead keratinocytes because they lost all their organelles as they migrated upward, right, and gained more and more keratin. Something I didn't mention are all of these tight junctions. All of these connections between the cells are part of tight junctions. We spoke about that before. Those keep cells tightly attached together so nothing can leak between them. It's very important. It has a lot to do with cytoskeleton and intermediate filaments. Dendritic cells are the immune cells that can engulf invaders. Here's a tactile cell attached to a tactile disc. So again, you should be able to see mostly everything we spoke about. So now let's discuss skin color. And skin color results from 3 different pigments primarily. The most significant factor is melanin, which we've spoken about already, but hemoglobin also plays a role. So hemoglobin is the red color we get from red blood cells, which carry oxygen and carbon dioxide. Carotenes also play a role. Carotenes are lipid-soluble plant pigments that are used to make vitamin A. And those could go from violet to red-yellow to orange-yellow. So there are different kinds of carotenes. And finally, the most important is melanin. These are produced by melanocytes. Here's an example of a melanocyte. And melanocytes have these extensions that can penetrate into the layers of the epidermis, so they can deposit melanin granules into the keratinocytes, into the skin cells. And those melanin granules form UV shields over the nuclei of the keratinocytes, so it's protecting their DNA. Right? So melanin is like a protective shield against DNA. Against UV light, so DNA doesn't get damaged. So most people of different skin colors have essentially the same number of melanocytes and the same distribution of melanocytes. But the amount of melanin produced is genetically determined. Right? In dark skin, the melanocytes produce greater quantities of melanin, and they spread out more. In light skin, melanin is clumped near the keratinocyte nucleus, so it imparts less color to the cells. In lighter skin, it also breaks down more rapidly, so not as much is seen beyond the basal layer, if it's even there. The duration of UV exposure also influences the rate of melanin production, right? And this makes sense. So when you have more UV exposure, that means your DNA is more susceptible to damage. So your body's going to increase melanin production to shield the DNA from the threat of damage, right? So the amount of melanin also varies from place to place on the body. So let's talk a little bit more about skin color and how it evolved. So skin color of various human races results from different amounts of keratin and melanin that it inherited. The hemoglobin effect is relatively constant. Darker race skin have abundant melanin. Caucasians produce very little melanin, and as I said, they kind of store it differently. And people of Asian descent have a different form of melanin, so it's a different skin tone entirely. So you can see from this picture, the basal layer shows heavy deposits of melanin in darker skin, but light skin shows little to no visible melanin, right? But you still see the same epidermal cell. You see the same keratinocytes, they just don't have as much melanin in them. So UV light is both friend and foe. So on the good side, it helps benefit us with our vitamin D synthesis. But on the bad side, it can cause skin cancer and break down folate, which is a vitamin B that we need for normal cell division. So again, we have good things and bad things about UV, and exposure to UV light accounts for most of the diversity in skin tone. Populations that evolved in the tropics have very well melanized skin to protect themselves against excess UV. Populations that evolved in far northern or southern latitudes with weaker sun have light skin to allow for adequate UV, right? They wouldn't benefit from having excess melanin because then they would get the broken down folic acid, and skin cancer. The importance of vitamin D for calcium might explain why women in general are lighter skinned than men. So women have skin averaging about 4% lighter than men do. And again, that might be because vitamin D is so crucial for lactation and for pregnancy. It's possible to diagnose disease by looking at skin tone. So cyanosis is blueness of the skin resulting from a deficiency of oxygen in the circulating blood. And this oxygen deficiency turns the hemoglobin a violet color, which is lightened to blue-violet as it shows through the white dermal collagen. This can be caused because of choking, some kind of airway obstruction, or lung disease such as emphysema. You can also see cyanosis sometimes in very cold weather and cardiac arrest when the blood flow is very slow through the skin and that tissues consume its oxygen faster than newly oxygenated blood can arrive. So cyanosis is oxygen deficiency. Then we have an erythema. An erythema is an abnormal redness of the skin that just happens in hot weather or exercise, sunburn, embarrassment. Anytime you have increased blood flow to the skin, we have erythema. And that's, again, something very unique to humans. We don't see that in other animals. Then we have pallor, which is just a general sign of pale or ashen color, where there's little to no blood flow of the skin. They can result from stress, low blood pressure, cold temperature, or anemia. Albinism is a genetic lack of melanin. So again, genetic means it's a gene that's defective. So melanin is normally synthesized from an amino acid by the enzyme tyrosinase. People with albinism do not have a functional copy of tyrosinase, so they cannot make melanin at all. Finally, jaundice is a yellowing of the skin and the yellowing of the eyes from high levels of bilirubin in the blood. And bilirubin is a hemoglobin breakdown product. So normally when our red blood cells get old, they disintegrate, release their hemoglobin, and our liver and spleen convert that hemoglobin into bilirubin, which the liver can excrete as bile. But the bilirubin can accumulate enough to discolor the skin if you don't have a rapid rate of erythrocyte destruction. Right? If you have too many red blood cells building up, you're going to have too much bilirubin accumulating, and that means the liver cannot dispose of it properly. And that would give you the yellowing of the skin. And finally, we'll talk about a hematoma, which is a bruise. Basically just a mass of clotted blood that can show through the skin. And that can happen if you fall very easily, but it can also be because of a metabolic or nutritional disorder. So now we will talk about some accessory organs of the skin, starting with hair. So hair is found almost all over the body, with some exceptions. We don't have any hair on the soles of our feet, palms, nipples, lips, and parts of external genitalia. The limbs and trunks have about 55 to 70 hairs per square centimeter, and the face has about 10 times as many as that. In a man's beard, there are up to 30,000 hairs, and in a scalp, there are up to 100,000 different hairs. The hair functions to protect the body. So for example, the hair protects our scalp from sunlight, from UV radiation, from any mechanical injury. Hair itself has two parts. We have the hair shaft, which is the portion of a hair above the skin, right? And then we have the hair root, which is the part beneath the surface of the skin. The root penetrates deeply into the dermis or hypodermis and ends with what we call a bulb. So the hair bulb is really where the only living cells are near the bulb. Right, and that grows within a hair follicle. So the hair bulb of the follicle is the site where new cells grow. This is the basal layer, essentially. Right, so the only living cells of a hair are in and near the bulb. And the bulb is nourished by a dermal papilla. So the bulb grows around dermal papilla, which can provide the hair with the nutrition it needs to continually grow. So all of the cells up here are dead. All the cells outside of the hair bulb are dead. So we can look at different parts of the hair cell of hair. So we have three different portions. We have inside is the medulla. The medulla is a core of loosely arranged cells and air spaces. Then we have the cortex, which is the bulk of the hair, and it has different layers of elongated keratinized cells. And then on the outside, you have the cuticle, which is multiple layers of thin, scaly cells that overlap each other. And the texture of hair is relational to the cross-sectional shape. So the color of hair and the texture of hair has to do with the shape and structure of the cuticle and cortex. In straight hair, we have a very round cross-section of each hair. So blonde straight is very round, black straight is very round. In wavy hair, you have more of an oval cross-section. So here, this wavy hair is more of an oval cross-section. And tightly curled hair is relatively flat. So again, the hair texture is related to differences in cross-sectional shape. Hair color is due to pigment granules in the cells of the cortex. So remember, the cortex is this middle portion, and brown and black hair are rich in eumelanin. So that's one type of melanin. Red hair has a slight amount of eumelanin, but a high concentration of pheomelanin. So you can see these different colored pigments. Blonde hair has an intermediate amount of pheomelanin, but very little eumelanin. And finally, gray and white hair result from a scarcity or absence of melanins in the cortex and presence of air in the medulla. That's what makes it more light and a little thinner, because the airspace grows in the medulla as we age. So each hair has an erector muscle called an erector pili muscle, and that could contract and raise the hair in the follicle on its end. So in response to cold, fear, touch, or some other stimulus, the sympathetic nervous system can stimulate the erector to contract, making the hair stand on end. And in mammals, this piloerection, as it's called, traps an insulating layer of warm air next to the skin, and can also make some furry animals appear larger, so to scare a potential enemy. In humans, it does cause us to have goosebumps, but it serves no useful purpose. It does not make us seem bigger to an enemy. It does not make us any more warm in the cold. So it's basically something that came along for the evolutionary ride, but doesn't affect us because we don't have the same density of hair. So now we can talk about glands. Glands form from epidermis that grow inward into the dermis. So we'll talk about different glands. There are three major types. We have sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands secrete sebum, also known as oil. Sweat glands. We have two different kinds of sweat glands. And then ceruminous glands, which are wax glands. And there are three different ways that glands can secrete their substances. Merocrine, also known as Eccrine glands, release stuff by exocytosis. So they have vesicles containing stuff to be released, and that stuff will be released as the vesicle fuses with the plasma membrane. Apocrine is a little different. Apocrine secretion, done by fat cells, done by different cells when they want to secrete fat, they release droplets of fat in the membrane itself. So where in Merocrine, the membrane, the vesicle fuses with the membrane and only the protein and stuff leaves. And Apocrine, the whole vesicle leaves, including the membrane. And then in holocrine secretion, such as we see in sebaceous glands, the entire gland cell breaks down and becomes the secretion. So here's an intact cell, but over time the cell disintegrates and the entire cell and its contents get released. So these are three different modes of gland secretion you should be familiar with. Sebaceous glands secrete sebum, or oil, right? They do this in holocrine fashion, right? Because they empty the secretions into the hair follicles along with the cell membrane. So here's a sebaceous gland, and they release oil with the membrane itself, with patches of membrane, and that functions to moisturize skin and hair to prevent any dryness. Right? We need constant moisture on our skin. We don't want it to dry out. We don't want water to be lost. So this oil, right, this oily layer prevents any excess moisture from being lost, right? Reduces evaporative water loss. It can also help prevent us from having pathogens grow on us, so that oil can inhibit anything growing. So that's good. But we also know that excess oil can lead to acne. So comedogenesis is the formation of acne, and that can happen when there's too much oil released on the skin, because oil can also invite other pathogens to eat from. So again, so it's a kind of, oil can help prevent certain pathogens from accumulating on our skin, but sometimes that oil can be food for other infectious pathogens. One thing I will mention that's good about sebum is that's what gives our hair its nice shine. And interestingly, when we shampoo our hair, we're washing a lot of the sebum. And a lot of the times when we use facial washes, we're washing all the sebum from our skin. So excess sebum isn't good, but we end up replacing it with different skin creams and hand lotions that are actually made from sheep sebum sometimes. So a lot of the skin creams we use are also made of sebum, just from a different animal. So again, everything is a balance, right? You want to have the right amount of oil, not too much, not too little. So next we can talk about Sudoriferous glands or sweat glands. And sweat glands are of two kinds. We have Merocrine / Eccrine glands and Apocrine glands. So we'll talk about each of those, but regardless, they are tubular in shape, and they have a deep coiled secretory portion, like here, and they have a straight narrow duct that carries the secretion away from this deep coil portion. So each has a deep coil portion and then a duct. So deep coil portion and then a duct. But we'll see, depending on the different types of sweat glands, they secrete the sweat in different places. So Merocrine or Eccrine sweat glands are widely distributed over the entire body, but are especially abundant on palms, soles, and the forehead. Their primary function is to cool the body. These are active from birth. They give us a clear, watery sweat that's secreted directly onto the skin surface, right? It also, again, main purpose is to cool the body through evaporation. Overheating activates sweating through the sympathetic nervous system, and the evaporation of sweat carries away a substantial amount of body heat. So that's very, very important. It's also I should note some drugs are excreted in perspiration. So Eccrine sweat glands excrete some of the same waste as the kidneys do. So there's a slight contribution to excretion from the sweat. But perspiration is mostly 99% water. And then we could talk about Apocrine sweat glands. And these are scent glands that respond especially to stress and sexual stimulation. These are not active until puberty, and they're located in axillary, beard, and genital regions. Apocrine glands secrete their sweat into the hair follicle via exocytosis. So this is different. Before we said these Eccrine or Merocrine glands secreted the sweat directly onto the skin surface. This type of Apocrine sweat gland is releasing the sweat into the follicle by exocytosis. Side point, note this is misnamed. An Apocrine sweat gland does not use an apocrine mode of gland secretion. It does the same type of secretion as the Merocrine gland does, which is by exocytosis, not in droplets of fat. Anyway, the Apocrine sweat gland, again, is releasing a milkier sweat because it has more proteins and lipids. So the sweat from an Apocrine gland has more lipids in it, and it's odorless in itself. But what happens is some bacteria are attracted to it, and as they decompose those lipids, it produces a body odor. And these, again, become active at puberty, and they have a function because they produce pheromones, which has a role in sexual mating. So we spoke about Merocrine glands, Apocrine glands, and Sebaceous glands so far. And remember, they're just different. The Apocrine glands go into the hair follicle. Merocrine glands get secreted onto the skin surface. And these sebaceous glands, the entire cell starts to disintegrate, and the whole contents of the cell, including the cell membrane, get released from the sebaceous gland. So ceruminous glands are modified apocrine glands found only in the external ear canal. They produce wax, cerumen, that's very yellow, and it mixes sebum and dead epidermal cells. This is really important to keep foreign particles and insects outside of our eardrum, right? Outside of the external acoustic meatus. So it also, cerumen also keeps the eardrum pliable and waterproofs the ear canal. So again, the sticky stuff will prevent anything from crawling in, which is very good. Also keeps it waterproof and keeps the eardrum pliable. So nails are other accessory structures of the integumentary system. And fingernails and toenails are clear, hard derivatives of the stratum corneum. Right? And nails cover the distal surfaces of fingers and toes. So they are mostly made of keratin, right? They're dead, keratinized, tightly compact cells. Right? A lot of parallel fibers of hard keratin give nails their structure. Many mammals have claws, whereas flat nails are one of the distinguishing characteristics of humans and other primates. So our flat nails allow us to manipulate objects a little bit and groom a little more easy. And they're more sensitive, right? So more sensitive when we have flat nails as opposed to claws. The nail body we see over here is the visible attached part of the nail. Then you have a free edge on top. The nail root extends proximately over the under the overlaying skin. We have the lanula, is this white portion over here is called the lanula. And this groove over here can accumulate any dirt or bacteria, right, by the cuticle. The cuticle has a little groove that could basically accumulate any dirt and bacteria. So I think that's all you really need to know about the nail. I should mention that the nail root is deep to the skin, right? So it's underneath. The nail root is deep to the skin. It is underneath. And the reason why the lanula appears more opaque is because of the nail matrix is just so thick that it blocks any of the underlying blood vessels. So it appears white, right? This part is so thick that it appears white. So which layer of skin lacks blood vessels? The answer is C, the epidermis lacks blood vessels. What types of glands help regulate body temperature? So pause here. And the answer is A, the Merocrine or Eccrine glands. So now let's talk about body temperature. So average healthy body temperature is maintained at around 36.8 degrees Celsius. Again, this is an average. We can traditionally think about this as 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And all of our temperatures are fluctuating by about half a degree to 1.5 degrees. But any greater variation than 1.5 degrees can be life-threatening. And skin plays a key role in either conserving or dissipating heat. If our body temperature rises above normal, our thermoreceptors in our skin can send signals to the brain. The brain will detect the deviation from the norm and will then trigger the vasodilation of the skin's blood vessels. So the skin blood vessels will dilate, and that will increase the heat that's lost across the epidermis. Similarly, the brain will activate Merocrine sweat glands, so sweat will be lost and we'll have evaporative cooling. And as a response, our body heat will be lost to the surroundings, the sweat will cool us off, and temperature will drop toward the normal. Let's say our body temperature begins to drop. Then our thermoreceptors will again detect that something's deviated from normal, but this time it will tell the brain to trigger vasoconstriction of the skin blood vessels. When the blood vessels of the skin constrict, that means blood will be retained inside, will not be lost, right? All the blood and the heat will be kept inward. Also, all of the Merocrine sweat glands will be turned off, so no water will be lost. Also, the body can also stimulate skeletal muscles to shiver. That's basically involuntary contractions of skeletal muscles can generate heat by shivering. And all of that together will get our body temperature back to normal. So you should be familiar with these different feedback loops and thermoregulation. So in just a couple minutes, I want to walk through a couple of diseases of the skin that you should look in your book to learn more about. I just want to highlight a couple. Melanoma, etiology, meaning the cause of the disease is when you have a melanocyte that has uncontrolled cell growth. So it's cancer of the skin due to excessive exposure to the sun. And this is where you see an irregular patch of black or brown pigment that's changing in size. And it's the most dangerous type of skin cancer. So you would go to a dermatologist, they would take a biopsy, look under the microscope and see if it is benign or, unfortunately, if it's metastatic. Lyme disease is a bacterial infection spread by deer tick bites. It's very hard to diagnose sometimes, but the clear indicator is a rash that looks like a red circle with a lighter center, like a bullseye. There are some diagnostics. You could do a blood test, and to treat it, there are some antibiotics you can use or possibly a vaccine. But there are several symptoms that are for Lyme disease that are very widespread. Tinea is a fungal infection. Fungi usually like to grow in warm, moist regions of the body, and they cause very itchy skin. You might have to do a culture to confirm if it's fungal, but sometimes the doctor can just see it visually. Usually an antifungal medication is enough to treat the fungus. It can be topical, like a cream, or if it's an intense fungal infection, you might have to do a systemic, meaning like take it by mouth many times for weeks. Skin allergies include eczema and hives, which are inflammatory reactions that produce red, itchy rashes on the skin. Hives are usually more bumpy. Eczema is usually more flat. Eczema is usually allergic in origin, but can also be triggered by irritation or stress. Avoidance of the specific allergen is the best thing to do, but there are anti-inflammatory and antihistamine medications that are also effective. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about skin injuries, like skin burns. So a burn can be caused by heat, chemicals, electricity, or radiation. And the depth of a burn relates to the layer or layers of skin that were affected by the burn. So a first-degree burn involves only the epidermis, and it's marked by pain and redness. They can heal in a few days and don't leave scars. So sunburns are first-degree burns. A second-degree burn includes damage to the epidermis and the dermis, but leaves some part of the dermis intact. So these are also called partial thickness burns. These can get blistered and very painful. So you do see redness, but the epidermis could regenerate. So it's very severe sunburns. And if you scalded yourself on like hot milk, that would be a second-degree burn. A third-degree burn can lead to death. Those are called full thickness burns because the epidermis, all of the dermis, and even some of the hypodermis or muscle is affected. Since no dermis retains, the skin can only regenerate from the edges of the wound. So third degree burns often require skin grafts. So it can be life-threatening. Right, so partial thickness leaves some dermis intact. Full thickness leaves no dermis intact. So we need to use a skin graft. If it left to heal by itself, you might get what's called contracture, which is where the connective tissue doesn't connect to itself properly, and that can cause disfigurement. So these are the levels of burns. Just to note, there is no such thing as a healthy tan. UVA and UVB rays are both thought to initiate skin cancer, and skin sunscreens do protect you from sunburn, but we're not quite sure if they protect us against cancer per se, right? So we don't know. It's possible that the UV light could still damage our DNA and cause mutations. So always be cautious about sun exposure. Finally, I'd like you to pause here and take a close look at this diagram. This shows the effects of the integumentary system on all other organ systems. And this is fascinating. So a lot of us might not think the integumentary system is all that important, but it has great effects on every other part of the body. And this will come up in one of the assignments. So I suggest pausing here, taking a good look, and I think you'll find it very interesting. So that is the end of the integumentary system, and I will see you next time.